So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. My name is Susan Derwin, and I'm the director of the IHC. As the public face of the humanities for the campus, the center runs programs that draw upon the expertise, practices, and skills associated with the humanities to support scholars in their production of new knowledge and to empower community members as agents of social change. We are delighted you are attending today's event, which is part of this year's public event series, Too Much Information, and is being co-sponsored by the Hester and Cedric Crowell Endowment. Throughout the year, we will be exploring the experience of living in an age of information saturation. We will also consider fundamental institutions and practices that profoundly impact many people's lives about which there is too little information. Today's event falls under this latter category. Not only will it attend to the voices of those who are not sufficiently heard, people incarcerated in U.S. prisons, it will do so in part through a discussion of a literary genre that itself does not occupy a rightful place in our society. As Luis Rodríguez, one of today's speakers, notes in his recent collection of writings, and I quote, "We're in a country that marginalizes poetry, yet elsewhere all over the world, poetry is written, memorized, and recited, even in the most deprived areas. Poetry, like all art, needs to be at the center of our culture. Our country is deprived for lack of enriched expression, powerful performance, compelling language." I am grateful to Clint Terrell, a PhD student in the English department, for suggesting that we invite today's guest speakers to the IHC. Clint included the anthology Make a Poem Cry in an English course he taught this past summer. Thank you, Clint, so much. I would also like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located. And I would also like to pay respect to elders past and present, as well as other Indigenous people present. To begin our event, I'd like now to introduce Fabian Pavon, a PhD student in the Chicana and Chicano Studies Department and a Racial Justice Fellow. He is here today representing underground scholars and will be sharing with us 2 poems that he has written. Welcome, Fabian.
My teacher, Gloria Ansaldúa, once taught me that by the time we reach the neo-colonialist phase, we've accepted the white colonizer system of values, attitudes, morality, and modes of production. It is not by chance that in Texas, in the more rural towns, Chicano neighborhoods are called colonias rather than barrios. And so that quote by Gloria Ansaldúa inspired me to write this poem that I like to call Back of the Line. I am forced to go back in time, to dig deep into the essence at the back of my mind. I am forced to go back to the back of the line. Back to the time when I watched Moctezuma get thrown off the temple as he died. To the back of the line as I witnessed Cuauhtémoc be burned alive. That image is stuck deep in my mind, like when we were first divided by lines. And to speak Nahuatl and later Spanish became a crime. I had to suppress my ancestors to the essence present at the back of my mind. The colonizers' presence corrupted our leaders, turned them into vendidos, and polluted their vines. And now I'm forced to go back to the back of the line. But waiting my turn to get paid after cutting grapevines, it'll never compensate for the spray dropped by planes. Pesticides infect my child's brain. From the seeds to the roots to the leaves left behind. Listen, how many times must I go back to the back of the line? It should be a crime to have to justify my life this many times. But the colonized don't make the rules, nah. We can only single file line. One of the only times that I was at the front of the line was at Vietnam, where brothers died, and they often did so side by side. I should have been inside the university at that time, but those times reflected, again infected my people, but brown pride was the only thing that I think barely saved my life. But to deny me my history, there's no mystery as to the reason why, see, because it helps you keep me and my people shoved and stuck at the back of the line. History does not repeat itself. It's been this way the whole time. The only difference is that now I'm at the block. Money, weed, murder on my mind. Colonized, segregated, miseducated at the back of the free lunch line. See, I was not born like this. I was born into this. It's Los Angeles' red lines that forced me to have to dig deep into the back of my mind to try to find a way to articulate my oppression in this life and have to explain it over and over to deaf ears and blind eyes, only to be disregarded, discarded, left in the darkness, dwelling at the back of the line. So that's the first poem I wanted to share with you all. I got this next poem. Thank you. So this next poem is more a reflection of myself and my experience as a man of color, growing up in the city of Pomona, which is in the Los Angeles County, and just trying to make sense of my position in the world. And so there's this writer by the name of Kevin Powell, and he once said, "Throughout my life, my mother and society in general had told me what I should not be, but rarely did anyone say what I could or what I should be. A few older men, such as my boss, Sam Anderson, had served as role models here and there, and I had read Malcolm X's autobiography several times, digging endlessly for new lessons on manhood." And so that quote inspired me to write this poem that I like to call "As I Was Told What Not to Become." Check this out. Who am I? Where am I? What am I? Lost. I'm scared. I'm tired. I'm brown. I'm broken. And I'm searching for meaning. That's why I stay woke but stay dreaming. And on the inside I'm screaming, but on the outside I'm praying. I'm not religious, just saying. I'm brokenhearted with tears that fill up oceans, moving through the motions without showing emotion, constantly close to explosion. Don't even know how I focus. All I do sometimes is feel hopeless. Home is the heart and I'm homeless. Damn. What am I doing? I should be living. I should be loving. I should be feeling something, but I don't. I'm numb, I'm dumb, I'm cold like the grip of a gun. These are the things I became as I was told what not to become. I'm holding on to the sun, trying to keep it from going down. Trying to stop time from leaving me behind until I could figure this out. No role models in my childhood, but I still gotta be one now. How can I teach you to be better if I never knew how? I never went camping, I never went kayaking, I never went bowling. My primary extracurriculars involved drinking and smoking in order to enter the state of altered reality. Some might call that insanity, but I call it the only thing I ever knew about the man in me. Damn. You know what? Brotherhood, a sense of belonging. I think those are the things that I have been searching for. While on the street, while in a cell, while out with the homies. But all I ever found was men who felt just like me. With a broken mean mug that's scared, scarred, black, brown, lost, and hopeless. Moving through the motions, showing no emotions, too close to explosions, too close to being homeless, wasting time by trying to hang on to the sun. These are the things I became as I was told or not to become. Thank you. And I just want to say thank you, Luis Rodriguez. Your book, Always Running, was the first book I read from cover to cover in the 11th grade. And ever since then, that was the first time I seen myself seen in a book and made me want to read more books. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabian. And now to our speakers. Luis R. Rodriguez was the Poet Laureate of Los Angeles from 2014 through 2016. He is the author of 16 books of poetry, children's literature, fiction, and nonfiction, including the best-selling memoir, Always Running, La Vida Loca, Gang Days in LA. He is the founding editor of Tia Chucha Press and co-founder of Tia Chucha Centro Cultural and bookstore in the San Fernando Valley. Across 40 years, he taught creative writing and conducted poetry readings, lectures, and healing circles in prisons, juvenile lockups, and jails throughout the United States, Mexico, Central America, South America, and Europe. Kenneth E. Hartman was convicted of murder at 19 and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. After he had served 38 years, former California Governor Jerry Brown commuted his sentence, and Hartman was paroled in 2017. He is a freelance writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times and Harper's, and he is also working as a development coordinator and prison program specialist for a Los Angeles area nonprofit. Hartman edited Too Cruel, Not Unusual Enough, a collection of writings by people who are incarcerated about life sentences without the possibility of parole. The book won the 2014 Independent Publisher Book Award. His 2009 memoir, Mother California, A Story of Redemption Behind Bars, won the 2010 Eric Hoffer Award. It is my privilege to welcome Luis Rodriguez and Kenneth Hartman to the IHC to speak to us about their co-edited anthology, Make a Poem Cry, creative writing from California's Lancaster Prison. Thank you.
Fabian, I just want to say, man, that was fantastic if you're still here. There you are. Fantastic, man. So, yeah, I'm Ken Hartman, and somebody I met in the elevator referred to me as Mr. Hartman, so I'm Ken, and Mr. Hartman's like my dad, and that's like, makes me feel old. So Louis and I are going to have a conversation with each other, kind of, which we think ultimately will be more interesting and more revealing of what we hope to talk about. But I just want to reflect on what Susan said. Sorry. Met a lot of new people today already. With the idea of too much information, but coming from a place like I did for 38 years, which has not enough information. In fact, they deliberately block information from coming in. And I was really excited to learn, hi guys, I was really excited to learn that this school and you and other folks, I'm sure, are involved in bringing literature to folks inside prisons all over California. I was in prison long enough to remember when they did rehabilitation. When I first came in 1980, it was kind of the end of the rehabilitation era that was sort of flourished a bit in the 70s, and I watched it all disappear. And it was disappeared on the premise that people in prison didn't deserve to be given any opportunities to become better than their worst moments. And I think what that really translates to, if you want to put it in plain English, it said that people in prison are not human beings. And I think that's what we labored under, in the 80s and the 90s, the early 2000s. I think it's only been the last decade or so that there's been this opening in California and other places around the country, but not many, that it is possible that the people inside are human beings. And I think that, I personally believe that we all actually are human beings inside. And before the pandemic, when I would speak at colleges, I would often say the first thing you need to know about people in prison is they're human beings, and people would start clapping. And at first I thought, wow, I'm really good. I'm getting people to clap with that one line. But then I said to myself, why are they clapping to that notion? And I said, is this a surprise for you to learn this? But anyways, I ultimately we're going to talk, and I think that is better. But my transition here is So Louis, who I met when he was coming into prison to teach a writing class, always knew that we were human beings. And it's why he's one of my personal friends and a hero of mine, and somebody I'm just really delighted to be sitting on a stage with today. So Louis, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Hartman. I'm just playing. We're good old friends, and it's really great to see everybody. And Fabian, yes, beautiful work, and I really appreciate that. I know it means a lot, it comes from the heart, and that's really what I think this is all about. I think all I know is how to speak from that level, and I want to speak from that because this is what the book we're trying to promote here and push is a book of a lot of heartfelt thoughts and ideas from people behind bars, and that it comes from one of my classes, from my classes there at Lancaster Prison, where I actually met Ken. Oh, was that 2007? I'm trying to think. Anyway, I started teaching classes there regularly there, and as you know, as was mentioned, I've been doing it since 1980, 81. I forget what year I actually started. I think it might have been 81, and one thing I do want to point out, the reason why I started doing these classes, I started creative writing classes in Chino, and then I would come in just to do poetry readings and or talks or healing circles. But in 2007, I started doing classes on a regular basis, all the way up to the pandemic, 2022, I stopped. But one of the reasons why I did that is because I didn't want to forget my homies, and that's a way that I have to put it. I was fortunate, if you read Always Running, you know I was a very troubled young man. I was on heroin for 7 years. I was in and out of jail, juvenile hall, 2 adult facilities. But I got helped. And this to me is important. Somebody stood around and made sure I was given knowledge, awareness, connections. And I just want to recognize my good friend, Marcus here. We know each other for, was it 40, 45 years? I don't know, but we know each other a long time. And he knows the struggles that we've been through. It was these revolutionary thinking activists that came out into my neighborhood and tried to help a lot of us lost kids. And I was probably the only one that this one particular guy helped. And I have to thank him because, I'll tell you the way it works. It wasn't that he saved me, but he gave me the tools, the connections, and the resources to save myself. And to me, that is more powerful. And so I avoided all the state prison time that a lot of people did, but I never forgot my homies. You know what I'm saying? So when I was 25 and I had already become a writer by then, I decided to go into the institutions, and again, at a time when it was all going away. In 1980, 81, there was a lot of sabotage of the work some of us were trying to do. A lot of the CEOs and or staff were not helping. Somebody obviously wanted me there, so that's why I was there. I want to mention another mentor I had at the time, Manasar Gamboa, who was my teacher there. He did 17 years, was 20 years a heroin addict. He changed his life, and he helped me facilitate these classes. And I learned a lot from him. I just want to mention that because that's a very important part of the story. The only other part of the story I want to add is Ken is also a good friend to my son, Ramiro, who ended up doing 15 years himself. And that's another story. It's part of the other book I have here, Calls You Back, the second memoir, my relationship with my son, which is very heartbreaking when you try to leave that world, try to leave all the drugs and jails and everything, and then your own son falls into the very traps. It was very difficult, and I would just let you know it was hard. But at a certain point, I was very angry that he got involved with gangs and got involved with all this trouble. And we were living in Chicago at the time, which is, Chicago's pretty bad news. I can't tell you which is worse, LA, Chicago, because I know both of them very well. They're both pretty bad when it comes to that kind of world. But I will say this, I was gonna throw my son away like my dad had done me. My parents kicked me out when I was 15, and I was homeless for 3 years, and I never really got back to my family. But I couldn't do it with my son. I just couldn't do it. I tried to do it. It wasn't gonna work. And I remember he had run off, and I chased him down, and I found him, and I brought him back home, and I just told him, I'm gonna go on this ride with you, whatever it is. this roller coaster through hell, I guess. And I'm not gonna stop until we figure out what we're gonna do. I couldn't put my son in that world by himself. I was concerned that he wasn't gonna make it. If I barely made it, he wasn't gonna. But I will have to say that he ended up doing all that prison time. He did come out much, much better in the end. And he knows him very well. Anybody that knows my son Ramiro, he's 47 years old. He's a grandfather. He's a grown man, but he's a very decent, positive young man. So I want to mention that. I want to read a poem, and I want to do it from this book because, again, this is one of the ways that I give back. I publish the works of a lot of the people that I teach. I've done it with homeless in Chicago. I did books at homeless people that we were doing in the shelters there. And I've done 2 or 3 prison books writing. But I want to share at least from one of the guys in my classes. And I'm just going to say their words. Their words are better than anything I could say. So this is called Don't Change the Direction, Direct the Change. And it's from Dante Duchamp Hayes. Balance the rage. Balance the dark matter and naivety. Balance the perception of reality, dreams. Focus, now pay attention. Everything isn't what it seems. To create what for you is most important, be determined and willing to navigate through something foreign, unbeknown, unfamiliar, completely new. The terrain is territory when viewed as something to do. The people, family, friends, allies, through thick and thin, the obligation to differentiate those who pretend from those who really want to win. Then the planning can begin. The goals on paper mapped out like a mission statement, headed to that destination designated for me and patiently waiting for my arrival. Each and every one of us exploring our genius, key to survival.
And I'm going to read one out of the book too. And I just want to say just a couple of additional things about this book. There were like boxes filled of submissions. I mean, and I think as I know Fabian knows, and anyone else who's ever been in prison or worked in prison, there's an enormous amount of talent inside prisons because they're full of people. And this is by a guy named Hanif Talib. It's called Year of Existence. Born innocent, born pure. Today I'm none of that. Robbed of my youth by youths who were robbed of theirs before me. I've seen a lot early, but been through more than I seen. I leaned on the boys from the park more often than not when kicked out of Jerry's spot. Forced maturation, maturity before puberty. Home life and street life kept separate, did homework and concealed weapons. Ticking seconds to pick life passing as night replaces day. Played chicken with the reaper daily. Tandra told me repeatedly the streets don't play. Heavy metal to equal the playing field. Future birthdays stayed in jeopardy. Avoided the pine box, but got trapped in the can. Doing all I can to get back to her, him, and them. Hourglass running on E. Am I coming or going? Salat to calm a soul that's hurting. Taqwa to cool a mind that's been burning. I'm trying to put layers on an untold evil, but my words hang in the balance of conflicting mind, unhinged at the temples. Hard liquor contaminates my temple. Temporary feel-goodness due to prohibited liquids. Allah is oft forgiving. I'm letting you in, invading my personal, conversing with y'all on a personal level. Today, I'm grateful. Another year of existence is a milestone.
So I think it would be good if me and Ken just talk, as we usually do. We have really good talks, me and him, and talk but share with you. One thing I do want to say, and it's important for me, is I actually have a granddaughter that's in prison right now. And it is sad when you have another generation into that world. And the only thing that I will say, well, two things. One, she's in a prison in Arroyo where my son was at. That's where he did all his prison time. She's in the same prison that he was in when it was an all-male facility. Now it's all-female. And she's in the same cell house that he was in. And I think that the thing that makes a difference, but it's important to point out, because people think, well, you guys must have bad families, bad life. Me and my son, we had a rough time. We'll admit it, and we dealt with it badly, and we dealt with it well. But my granddaughter grew up in a good household. She grew up with a good mother. She was a single mom, but she, because her dad, my brother, my son, was in prison most of the time. But what happens even when you have a good family, when you're out in these communities where she grew up, there's no work. Northern Illinois, there was no work, there was no jobs, and the only thing that they could find was crystal meth and fentanyl. She was on that for going to 7 years before she ended up in prison. That is not a situation that she was supposedly at fault with. You know what I'm trying to point out? It was an environment that she fell into. She wasn't born to be in prison, nobody is. But I want to talk about these environments because we have them all over. And I'm not saying there's a personal responsibility. I mean, Kenneth, no, there's a lot of things that you have to do personally if you're given whatever you're given. But people should know the world that we're in. People should know there's so many factors that contribute to people end up in these situations. And I do feel that there's kind of a generating, breathing, like a whirlpool that starts pulling certain people who are left at the margins or for whatever reason get lost and they get pulled in. And we created that whirlpool. And many of us think it's great and it's fine, but we have a huge mass incarceration system that is just being fed our young people over and over again. So I just wanted to start with that and maybe hear from Ken a little bit about what you think that environment is, how it contributes. Again, we can talk about personal responsibility, but I do want to talk about these bigger issues so people understand the world that we're in. There is a world that's, the whirlpool starts pulling you in, and we have to do whatever we can to stop that. What do you think about some of that situation?
Yeah, so I grew up in North Long Beach, California, which is sort of like the southern side of LA County, and it is when I lived there, it was a very poor, primarily white community, and a lot of people went to prison. And I often tell people that you find every kind of type of person in prison except rich people, except people who come from pretty nice areas with good educational systems and good access to jobs and, and all that kind of stuff. Clearly, mass incarceration disproportionately impacts people of color, but there's poor white people in there too. I was one of them, I know. And I think that there's this sort of this myth was created again when we go back to the beginning of mass incarceration. This myth was created that the people that are in there, they're evil, they're bad, they're not fully human. I remember things like they forfeited their rights to be humans, things like that. Leaders in our society saying things like that. They can parole in a pine box. I remember that kind of thing being said. And I remember thinking about, well, that really sucks. But I think the bigger picture, like Louis was painting, like where I grew up in a city that at one point was an industrial hub. It had a huge port. It had McDonnell Douglas. It had automobile plants. It had oil refineries. And it had all these things started to go away. And the people that were left behind couldn't find any jobs. And where I lived, people were, more and more people were, ending up on welfare. We're ending up out of work, people sitting around. And, I listened to someone, I wish I could remember their name right now, but it was a guy, he was a college professor actually, and he was on a talk show. And he said, the most dangerous thing in the world is a bunch of young men with no prospects, wherever you go on the planet. And that's what was that. And, you can hardly see it anymore because the tattoo's faded, but it used to say Ramona Park Locals, which is where I grew up. That's what park I hung out at. And what it was a bunch of young men with no prospects. That's what it was. And bad things came of that, and like Louis also alluded to, it doesn't excuse anyone's responsibility for the actions that they took. And myself in particular, I'm not in any way saying that I was, somehow victimized by my own actions, but I didn't live in a place that had a lot of options. And maybe my life would have been different if I had been in a place that had more options. And that, the last thing I'll say on this is I've been to Norway 3 times now since I've been out. to visit their prisons because I can't get enough prison apparently. And one of the things that I found most remarkable about the prison system is this. When you get there, they say, you're a member of our community, we care about you, and we want to help you get out as fast as possible. When you go to prison in this country, it's, you're a piece of crap, and we're going to make you suffer for the rest of your life, and you earned this, and you deal with it. And I mean, the difference could not be more stark, and I apologize if I offended anybody, but I do curse occasionally. Prison is a salty place. But I think that's the huge difference. And what I'm going to turn this back to my friend Louis and say, so Louis, all those years you were going in, teaching classes, you sort of alluded to why you wanted to do it, but what did you really get out of it?
Well, it's very important for people to know that those people behind bars, as some people say, they're the worst of ours. They're our community, they're our family. They're some of the best, most decent human beings I ever met and worked with. And I know that many of them, most of them, have done pretty bad things. And a lot of people do a lot of things, but you got to know the deep humanity that's in those institutions. And part of the thing is when you open up to that and when they know you're real about that and they know you're open to it, they really want to show you how human they can be, how decent they can be. I've never had anybody but show me decency in all the times I've gone in some of the worst institutions you can imagine. And because they want to let you know I am human and you're open to see this and to hear this. Most of the time, most people aren't, and this is why they close down. You're not going to give something that nobody wants to take, you know what I mean? But they give it to you when they see that you're open. And I think going back to this industry thing, I think it's important for me is we had all these jobs, as Kenneth talked about, in this country. All over, industry was big, and I worked in media. That's what kept me from getting in more trouble. Because I worked in a steel mill, and I worked in lead foundries, and I worked in all this industry. By 1970, they started to go away. By 1980, it picked up really bad. 1970, around that time, early 70s, California had 15,000 prisoners in 15 institutions. And then you can see, how did it end up with 34 institutions? And at the highest, about 175,000, there's a lot less now. What happened? But you see the perfect storm. Industry was leaving. By the 80s, it got worse. LA is the largest manufacturing center in the country. In 84, when the steel mill I worked in closed, 300 factories and plants, shipyards, everything were closing. Just that 1 year alone. Hundreds closed down after that. And I'll tell you what the perfect storm was too. Crack comes in 1980, 81, 82. I know I was there. I know exactly when it happened. Guns, all of a sudden, were available everywhere. I know. There was and this is a national thing, I'm talking about California, but in Chicago, just so you know, because I did work there, there's a community in the 10th Ward. Big U.S. steel plant, huge. All the communities worked there. It was mostly a Mexican community. They worked there for generations. Beautiful church, Guadalupe Church, in this one community. The plant closed, I don't know the exact year, but I will tell you in a short period of time, the local gang, the Latin Kings, was not a big deal. It was a street gang, not a big deal. But in short order, it became a criminal enterprise. They became a cohesive group of people because the one thing that they could do was sell drugs. Because drugs popped up everywhere, guns popped up everywhere. You understand what I'm pointing out to? I don't think this is an accident. I think it's by design. And this is important for me to point out because we all fall into these traps. I get it. We all play ourselves. A lot of the guys, they tell you, I played myself. I fell into the trap. I did the gang thing. I did the drug thing. Whatever it must be, I did it, you know. But you need to know how this was contributed. A perfect storm that eventually included more prisons and more prisons. And this is not just a Republican problem. This is a Democrat problem. This is a problem of anybody that was in power during those years that made sure there was enough prisons to fill the problem they were creating. So I go back to that to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. But the real point I think you're trying to make is when you're in the prison, you don't see that, you don't get to deal with that, you deal with a human being. who's having to deal with whatever has been given, and they're going to have to make those decisions. In spite of all that, that will keep them decent and whole, and maybe even do some healing. Where do I want to go? How did it work for you, my friend? I mean, your process, what happened to you?
Yeah. So I was in the hole. When I first came to prison, I was a young blockhead, and I wanted to be the toughest guy on the yard, and I lifted weights, and I did drugs, and I committed acts of violence, and did everything that I was supposed to do, because that's what the prison system really wants you to do. They love that. That's their favorite thing. Oh, we got that guy. He's hooked in. We'll have him for the rest of his life, and he'll be just fantastic for us. And then as the years went on and my brain started to harden up and work properly, because, we actually know now that young men's brains don't work very well until they're in their mid-20s. That science has shown that. I think mine waited till like late 20s, actually, because, it's an exceptionally thick-headed Irish guy, I guess. But, so I got in my late 20s, I started realizing, like, whoa, what have I done with my life here? I had life without the possibility of parole. I was on a level 4 yard, 180 design prison. It was like endless violence, endless idiocy committed by everybody on all sides. And I had this sort of awakening in my mind. I was like, wait a minute, this is really stupid. Why am I involved in this? And I started getting a little bit involved in political activism. I kind of like, somehow or other, I kind of figured out, like, wait a minute, we're all being played here. And that included everybody. It included the officers were being played. Everybody was being played. The whole system is like this giant game to screw people. And I saw this, and I started, getting involved in like legal activism and stuff. I'm not a lawyer, but I pretended to be a lawyer in prison for a while, like a lot of people do. And I ended up testifying in a federal trial against the prison where I was at, and giving away a good scene from my memoir, I think. But the magistrate judge asked me, do they ever make you stand out in the snow and the rain waiting to pick up your medications? And I said, yeah, they do it all the time. And he kind of leans forward and he says, well, what if I was to tell you that an official of this prison testified under oath that they never do that? And I said, well, that prison official is a liar. I didn't realize the guy who actually did it was sitting right behind the judge, and I knew immediately because his face turned bright red, and I went, no, that wasn't good. That's not going to go well. And about a week later, I was in the hole, and I, trumped something up to put me in the hole, and I'm sitting in the hole. And I come out of the hole, I don't know, a couple months later, because they didn't really have anything on me. And I come out of this yard, never been before, and I saw a little sign-up sheet, and it said, creative writing class, UCLA extension. And it was taught by a man named David Scott Milton, which was taught classes in prison for many, many years. He's passed away. I had the great fortune to be able to spend some time with him on the outside after I got out, before he died. Great guy, and he just taught this like really cool writing class. And I think for me, like looking at it, and I know from being in classes that you did, in prison, you are very rarely are you treated like you're a creative being, that you're like somebody that could do something that's good and beautiful and meaningful. And he did. He taught all of us. He treated us all. He taught screenwriting at USC. And he would often tell us the story. He'd say, those guys at USC, our students there, they write the most perfect papers. They have great use of language. The grammar is fantastic. But he'd say, but they don't have any stories. You guys have stories. And we would all kind of puff up and go, we got stories. We're better than those guys at USC. But he treated us like human beings that were valuable. And I think for me, in my life now, I'm also, I didn't put it down, but I'm also the director of advocacy for an organization called the Transformative In-Prison Work Group. And we represent small community-based organizations that go into prisons and do rehabilitative, healing, transformative type programs, unlike the useless programs that the state of California provides. These actually help people and treat them like fellow human beings. And those kind of programs are how people become better. And when you're sitting inside of a concrete box being told for your whole life you're basically a piece of crap, you need some healing. And I murdered a man named Thomas Allen Fellows. You know, I'm gonna always say his name because it's important. I did that. I'm guilty of that. And he's not the only person I hurt in my life. I hurt other people in my life too. And I had to learn how to come to terms with that, and had to learn how to love myself and forgive myself, which took me a very long time, and I'm still working on it. But those kind of programs do that. You know, the state programs, they say, well, you know, I'm gonna teach you how to fill out a job application. All right, that's great, I guess, you know, but like, I need to be able to figure out how to be a human being first, because you basically beat it out of me for the past 25 years. But I think, Louis, since I'm not gonna do all the talking here, I think they're really here to hear you.
No. This is very valuable. And one of the things I wanted to say when I first came around, Kenneth, I actually heard from people that you were, years ago, you were bad news.
I was.
People told me.
I was.
Horse.
That's what they called me.
Yeah. Said, well, you know, he was bad news. But they came to me when he was in my class. He's not that same guy. And so I had him in my class, and I found him to be not only very, you know, tender, you know, very respectful, extremely talented. And one thing I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot of creative, talented people sitting behind bars. Some of the most creative, talented people in the world are sitting there. And they're not just people, some of them have worked on novels, some of them have worked on major projects, and they're not going to go anywhere with them, but they're actually creating things all the time. And so my class was made up of people like that, as well as people who had never written anything, but I had to learn how to balance so that those that all of them get something out of my class, the ones that have been there writing for a long time, and those that just barely opening up. And we worked it out so all the guys could be given, they could be that rhythm, you know, where everybody could feel good. Sometimes it was just journal writing, which for a long time the prison was giving journals. Finally, they gave journals to everybody. We were able to get them out to people, and that was amazing. Some of them just writing was amazing for them, sitting in the cell, just writing their thoughts and feelings. It was very redemptive, and I always tell people, my class isn't about just writing, it's about creative thinking and creative living. Yes, creative writing, but it's about knowing how to live and using language and words and story to be able to put your life in some kind of wholeness, because they're fractured human beings sitting there and they need to get to that wholeness. And so I was fortunate to have met him when he wasn't this bad news that everybody would talk about, because he was always really good. But he was also very good with the others. He taught as he spoke, and he was good about taking into account the needs of these guys. And so to me, that's what's important, is that everybody starts helping each other. I think that you learn in prison, because I've been there long enough to know, but he knows better than I do, that you have to have a way of protocols for how to exist in prison. They're very good about creating these. You hear about the violence, and it's there. You hear about the fights, and there's people that do that. But what you don't hear about, most people sitting in those locked and closed places can find ways to live together. You know what I'm saying? And they have these really strict, important protocols. And when they come to my class in general, they like the classes. They're going to make sure people are going to participate and not mess them up. And I know that. I mean, nobody comes in here roughing everything up. They come in there willing to participate and do good. And I remember when some of the playtimes, maybe not when he was in there, but young guys would pop up and start making a lot of noise, talking bad, and I see the older guys would just give them looks or just say, not here. You know what I mean? It was all respectful, man. Nobody lost it. I'll tell you one story, then he can throw in some more stories. But one of the best stories is this guy had done, like I think 6-7 years in the SHU, Pelican Bay. And you could tell from his life and story, he'd been through a lot. And a black guy, he was a very good writer, very good speaker. But he, at a certain point in my class, he comes up and he say, I'm gonna let you people know, when I was sitting in the SHU, I contemplated committing suicide. And I don't mind telling you guys now, because I don't think about this anymore. And you don't talk about suicide in these places, but I don't mind telling you, but I'm not there. But I want to read you this piece that I wrote about it. So he did, wrote this whole piece about what he was going through, sitting in the SHU. So he finishes, and it was really powerful. We're all sitting around, and everybody's quiet, you know, because they're taking the account what he says. And all of a sudden, this one Chicano guy gets up, and he had been in the prison like 34 years at the time. And he stands up, and people talk about black and brown don't get along, you know, but all my classes were, they got along, all races, they were really good. But he gets up and walks over to the black guy in the middle bar, sitting around there talking about what he was like. Everybody got quiet, and we don't know what he's gonna do. What's he gonna do? He goes over and walks to the black guy, and then goes and hugs him. And he hugs him, and the guy, black guy was like, well, why'd you do that? And he goes, because I did 26 years in the shoe, and I know exactly what you're talking about. This is the kind of things that can happen. And he could have been a hard-nosed, hey, I didn't want to attend you. He didn't know. He would relate it to him. I know exactly what you're talking about. And it was beautiful. And everybody could see that, and you can see there's a commonality here, which I think is important to create. A commonality among so many differences. The differences are important, but to know that we're all basically in the same boat here. What can we do to help each other? And maybe you got stories that you can relate. If you don't mind, I want to step out real quick.
Okay. No problem. I have so many stories it would take me too long to tell you even a tiny fraction of them because I was in for 38 years. But I think one of the things that Louis brought up right there I think is really important too. I think there's this sort of this idea that like prison is this everybody hates each other, it's this endless race war, you know, nobody can get along. The truth is most of the time we do get along. Most of the time people do just fine, yard runs, you know, things happen. And if you can get to a prison where there are programs and there are things to do, then usually all the bad stuff slows down and can even stop. And I think one of the things I think, to go back to the Norway thing, because California has made some noises that it would like to use the Norway model, as they call it. Some of us are somewhat dubious of that actually happening, but I'd love to see it. But, you know, if you go back about 40 years, the Norwegian system was a lot like the California system. And people say, well, you know, Norway is nothing like the US. I mean, Norway is like almost all white people and everybody's basically the same. It's a homogenous thing, it's very small. But before they changed it to the way they run it now, they had pretty much the same outcomes that our prison system has now. It was violent, they had drug problems, they had staff assaults, they had lots of bad outcomes, and they had a very high recidivism rate like we do in this country now. They changed the way they do prison, and then people started acting differently. And for some reason, this is shocking to people, but you know, if you treat people badly, they often don't act well, you know? Again, it's a hard thing to imagine, right? We're gonna go questions in just a couple minutes, but if you wanna ask something right now, go ahead.
I just wanted to amplify that another thing Norwegians do with their sort of crime punishment system is no one's in for life. Everyone has a date that they're leaving, and that puts the onus on the society to help rather than the individual to create something from nothing.
Right, you're absolutely right. There are no life sentences in Norway. There's a maximum amount of time that you can serve. I mean, there's a lot of things that are now radically different than the way we do it. But I think, and thank you for saying that, reminding me, but I think what it really boils down to, again, is people in prison are treated as if they are fellow human beings, and then people that are treated as if they're fellow humans are much more likely to act like fellow human beings. And again, this is not shocking. You know, it's like common sense, really, I think. But the other thing, when Louis is talking about, you know, people hugging each other and stuff like that, so, you know, you know about the Honor Yard and A Yard in Lancaster that, you know, that we helped create and everything. You know, we had a yard where people basically said, I will conduct myself in a good way. I will, you know, stop prison politics, which what that means in the real world is basically, you know, race and gang stuff and all that. We're going to stop doing that. We're going to, you know, act like good guys and conduct ourselves well. And on that yard, almost immediately, there was no violence. The place ran like a clock for years and years. And the only people who hated it fundamentally was the prison administration, because it made their programs look really bad, because we had created a yard and it was created by incarcerated people. We are the ones who envisioned it. I actually wrote the original proposal and a bunch of other people were participated in it. But I mean, ultimately, it created a functioning society of people who treated each other well. And I can remember administrators coming from other California prisons and talking to me and saying, how did you do this? Because they would look out there and they would see black people, brown people, white people, all people praying together, playing sports together, you know, all that. It totally worked. Happy to tell you about it if you'd like to learn. It worked very well, and we're trying to make something like that happen again because it is doable. Again, because we too are human beings, just like those Norwegians. They're not better than us. We're just as good as they are. So, you know, and I think we're kind of running close to time where we were going to definitely solicit questions from everybody, but I definitely want to hear more from Louis about writing and all that other good stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of, maybe after this we can open it up to you all. I just want to add to that is that in this one prison, Lancaster, and I've been through many prisons up and down the state, but the last few years with the Lancaster, there is a level 4 yard there, which is B yard, is general population. And up to that point, B yard had no programming and was violent all the time, lockdowns all the time. And it wasn't just me, but me and others said, open up B yard for programming. It works at A yard, open up B yard. Well, the staff was adamant, no, they're never gonna go for it. That is the worst idea. But we finally got them to do it. I was actually one of the first classes in B yard when they opened it up. And people would show up to all the classes and they started to participate very well. And again, violence went down, drug use went down. A lot of things that you think, you know, it all went down. People wanted these classes, they wanted to connect, and they were willing to do what they needed to do so that they could have them. And B Yard is a success story as well. Even though since the pandemic, we're not sure about the programming, we're not sure how well they're doing it, you know better than I do. They've stopped a lot of things. There is a lot of backlash to creating a humane ways of dealing with these guys behind, men and women, by the way, because I went to CIW as well, and I can tell you horror stories about the women's prison. But there's a big backlash, and not just siding within the prisons themselves. And so I think part of my effort and part of this book is to convince people, don't fall for that. We don't need more people in bars, behind bars. We don't need prisons that take away your humanity away. We don't need ways to just warehouse people. Going to Norway and other places, because Europe has a lot of innovative ways of doing things, is really good. But I would just really quickly point out, I went to prisons in El Salvador, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Argentina, and Mexico. And in those countries, a few years ago, they didn't have life sentences either. They had up to 25 years for murder, 12 years for robbery, 8 years for car theft. No, they had clear, definite sentences. Got. Well, now, if you go to those countries now, they're emulating the U.S. system. And now they got almost the same thing. They got even the kind of super max-looking prisons. Now they got them there. And so they're emulating us instead of us emulating the good things. People are emulating the worst things that we can do. So I don't know if you want to open it now or... I wanted to end with a poem. Maybe you got another one. Let's do another poem.
Let's do another poem.
Because it's really good to hear the voices of these guys. So this is one by Eric Nicholson. It's called Sing of Truth. Sing a song of truth. Sing proud and strong. Sing for the old and the new. Sing of me, sing of you. Sing that all may hear of struggles of the past. Sing your message through. Sing for the weak and the strong. Sing loud and true. Sing away the pain. Sing for hope and joy. Sing for our nation, every man, woman, girl, and boy. Sing for the lost and remember the dead as we sing of the grind and getting ahead. Sing of our soul. Sing of our faith. Sing of our hope. Sing of our grace. Sing to smile. Sing to cry. Sing from our birth into our time to die. Sing for love. Sing for self. Sing for the memories of our cultural wealth. Sing for the glory still locked inside, regardless of the history they try to hide. Lift your voices in one regard, so the world may once again feel the presence of God. Sing, sing, sing of me, sing of you.
So this is actually by a fairly famous poet named Spoon Jackson. You guys may have heard of him. He's still serving life without parole. He's been in prison for now more than 42 years, I believe. He came into prison when he was I think 18 years old. And he's a tremendous poet. He's been published all over the world, and I know him very well. He's a good man. This is a poem named Heal. Like a heart that keeps giving, I must keep believing in the power of healing. Sometimes I grind down so hard on my teeth, I crack them during sleep. I must wear a tooth guard at night. Sometimes a long, deep cry alone or with a loved one will open your eyes, your heart, to the power of healing. Like a heart that keeps giving, I must keep believing in the powers of healing. Sometimes just a smile, a hug, a kiss, or hello will heal the soul. Sometimes a book, a letter, a song, a poem, a dream, or loss of a loved one will open your eyes, your heart, to the power of healing. Sometimes a long silence, solitude, a tree, a meadow, get this right, a long howl or swallow's song will open your eyes, your heart, to the power of healing. I don't know what or who I have not forgiven, and I know there's something that needs healing, like a heart that keeps giving. I must keep believing, I must keep believing in the power of healing.
Well, you get a little taste of the amazing work that's possible, but I think we want to hear from you all.
So we'll give you mics, so just raise your hand, we'll read the mic so we can hear you.
This isn't much of a question.
But we're recording, so we do want to.
Sorry, our parking pass is going to expire, but I just want to say thank you for having us. Thank you guys so much. I know that book my way when I read it
Thank you.
a few years ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks. All right, you can say.
Thank you for speaking and for being here. We know that people like Rios Lopez, the political prisoner, got released from Puerto Rico. Peltier is still in prison. Many are political prisoners, and all the prisoners really political prisoners because of poverty. But because of that, your emancipation, where did it start, and how does that emancipation have to do with poetry?
Want me to say something?
Yeah.
I mean, I can say for myself, though I'm not a poet, I wish I was a poet. I love poetry, and I'm not a poet. I write memoir and essays and things like that myself. But I can say that for me, exercising creativity and thinking deeply, it helped me to find like my best self. And I think to me, that's the power of creative pursuits. It's the power of the arts. You know, the arts are one of the few things that have like real evidence. I think there actually is real evidence, could be got in other things. But the arts have real evidence that if people who participate in arts programs in prison are much less likely to come back to prison than people who don't. So arts programs, and I think if you extend that out to the humanities, you know, to reading, to participating in literature, I think all of those things help you find your best self. That's how I see it. But I'm curious what you think, because you are an actual poet, and a good one too.
And poetry for me is what I call soul talk. It's a depth of language that I want my people in my classes to get to. Sometimes it's hard because with language we can be hiding more than we're revealing. So I'm always trying to use the language that really opens up who you are in your heart. There's an indigenous thing that Mexica thing called Enisli in Yolot, and it means face and heart. And I've had it in my classes where I've had the guys, okay, it's the word for person. There's no word for person in Nahuatl. So they use Enisli in Yolot. They use metaphors. Face and heart, that's a person. What are they meaning though? There's two sides to us, what you see and what's inside. What's your appearance, what's your essence. And the whole idea is to hopefully be aligned. And these guys really love that because I even have them write exercises about, okay, what is your face? What do you show the world? What is the mask that you're wearing that everybody has? And but what's really inside of you? And then it opens them up to talk about what's really inside. And so I think, because I want them to get to that depth, what poetry is that soul depth talk. Tell me what you can't tell nobody else. Tell me what you're telling yourself in yourselves deep inside of you that maybe bring a lot of emotion that you can't share nowhere else. And that to me is a very powerful way to get to what poetry does. So, yeah.
You can see why he has great glasses, right?
Mr. Rodriguez, I'd just like to say thank you. I don't know if you remember me, but about 15 some years ago, I took a group of kids from Los Pueblos High School to meet with you at Tia Chucha's. We sat around the round table, and you talked to these kids, and it was great. And I just want to say thank you again for talking to those kids from Los Pueblos. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you for that. Hope they're all doing good.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Hello. First of all, let me say that I went to prison as well, and I take 100% responsibility for it.
Yeah.
I don't blame anybody. I don't blame my parents. I don't blame the community. I don't blame the Democrats or the Republicans. I made those choices.
Yeah.
I made them. It's taken me a long time to deprogram from prison. I have so many questions, like, is Lancaster, is it all good or is it all bad? Is the yards that you were talking about, are they good or are they all bad? These are only things that certain people would understand. I saw Kenneth and I kept wondering, is he a skin or he's a wood or he's a white homie? I kept thinking these things, And I have to ask this, Mr. Rodriguez, do you ever feel that maybe your book glamorized that lifestyle a little bit? Because I read that book at a very impressionable age. When I was in the 7th grade, I read it. And I was able to find a lot of commonality between your life and mine. My parents were from Mexico, yours were too, I remember in your book you specifically wrote that you didn't exactly live in the hood. You lived just outside of the hood, And then I remember you talking about the constant violence between white students and Hispanic students, And all of that was ringing a bell with me because where I grew up at, it wasn't against white students, it was against black students. From the moment we hit junior high, we knew who our enemies were. They were all the black kids. When we were in high school, we knew who our enemies were. They were the black kids. So do you ever feel like maybe your book, in just one way, shape, or form, glamorized it just a little bit?
Well, I think that is such a powerful question that I really feel it deserves a really good answer. Let me tell you what my answer is. In order to write a book like this, and you gotta be real, whatever real is, that means you gotta be skirting the stereotypes and maybe even the glamour of why a young person would join a gang. You gotta get right next to it. You know what I'm saying? You gotta get next to why I talked about an 11-year-old kid, impressionable. I was 11 years old when I joined a gang. I was impressionable because I was broken down, I couldn't speak, I was silent, I had been bullied. I saw a gang break through the elementary school, and everybody was scared. Teachers got scared, and I wanted that power because I had no power. I had nothing. I said, I'm nobody. But these people were somebody. You got to skirt that point. But then, as you read the book, it's subversive. And I tell people, read the book all the way through. I'm sure you did. But the point is, you'll see how I subvert all those things. Yes, the glamour is there. The pool is there. I want to join the gang. But if you keep reading, you'll realize what I ended up learning. Eventually, the betrayal within the gang, my own, I was a very sensitive kid. It couldn't be sensitive in no gang. I had to mutate my humanity to be a tough guy. You stop being fully human. I couldn't do the sensitive things I used to do. I couldn't even think about them. Now I'm being mutated as this tough guy, and I had to be a tough guy. And I had to be such a tough guy that I did more fighting and shooting and stabbing than I did anything else in the gang. Not everybody in the gang was doing that. Why was I willing to do that? Because I had to be tougher than the next guy. You know what I'm saying? I had to be tougher than all of them because inside I was a little sensitive kid that couldn't express himself. And that's what I think is the power of that book and what that story is. But you're right. I get very close to glamorizing everything, the thing that pulls me in. But as you know, I subverted with poetry. Here was a kid with poetry. Here was a kid with art. I subverted with other stories. I try to subvert it by telling the story eventually of seeing my own son. And so I think that's the way that I would answer it. I think you're right. I've had police officers get mad at me and say, hey man, these kids, they love your book. They all want to be gangsters. And I go, they should read the whole book. You know, the whole thing is there. But you can't get you can't get people to understand the message unless you bring them right into that world that they're in. See what I'm saying?
And it was a good yard. However, that's not to say there were not some people who didn't agree with that. But it was not a bad yard. And I know exactly what you're saying. It was a good yard. But all that is kind of over now, right? The CDCR has sort of changed that. They've sort of done away with the bad yards and said basically everybody's got to live together, and if you don't, you're going to live in a really crappy place. And it's
The time that I was in there, I didn't even want to leave. I loved every second of the time that I was in prison. They actually had to drag me out because I didn't want to leave, because I found, for the first time in my life when I went in there, I was finally a part of something bigger than myself. And when I was in county jail and they were talking about, going upstate, and what are they talking about? And man, when you go upstate and you hear the homies sounding off, after being down for months on them, it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing that only
My son says the same thing, by the way.
certain people will ever really understand. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah, my
It's
son
just so beautiful.
says the same
It's a
thing.
beautiful thing. And the best part about being a homie, right, is that you could be any race.
No,
You know, you could be white, you could be black, you could be Armenian, you could be anything. You know, you could be Filipino, you could be a homie. And that's the thing that California had that I loved about it, It had the tradition.
Yeah.
It had the tradition of it.
So, I mean, and one thing that I do want to say something you said earlier, and I do take this seriously. Yes, I talk about all the environment that pulls everybody in. But if I also don't point out that you ultimately have to look at that person in the mirror, and you have to love that person enough to say, am I going to change for that person? You can't do it for any other reason. You know what I'm saying? So it's a combination of both things. Explaining the environment, but also saying you ultimately have to make those decisions. The decisions to do what he ended up having to do on his own. I tell my son, you changed not because of me, not because you changed because of you. You made that change yourself. And my son says the same thing. He actually says prison saved his life. That's the way it is with him, and that's fine. But he also made the changes he needed to make out of that. And that to me is what's important. He needs to own that. Just like you're saying, we need to own our liberation. So when I talk about the society doing all this, doesn't mean that we don't have a place to say, I'm not going to let society or anybody take that away from me. I'm going to own what I done or didn't do, and I'm going to own the change I need to have.
Thanks for asking.
All right, our final question.
Okay. I actually have two. One is really short, and the other one is I never heard of you before. I took my Chicano's study class about literature and everything. So I Googled you, and I researched a lot about you before I came here. So I learned that you actually experienced a lot of police brutality as a teen, harassment and everything like that. And there was an incident, a specific one that stood out to me when you were trying to help a woman from aggressive cops, and that actually landed you in jail and dropped out of college, and you lost your books contract, your very first books contract. So I guess my question is, like, what is your view on police now with everything? I mean, police brutality is still alive and well, and you do have family members who are police officers. So I want to know, like, how you work with that.
Well, I think one thing that Ken said, and maybe you can add to this, prison, but just like the street, we all get caught up in the same web. You understand? And even the people, the COs are in that way, whether they know it or not. And I try to be very humane to them as well and try to make sure they understand. I understand you're in this web. When they used to be really mean and hard, sabotage me and everything else, but I keep trying to be respectful in such a way that they know I get that you're in this. Well, that's in the street too. We're in the street, and they set up a situation where the police are at war with us, and we're at war with them. But the police actually admire us, and maybe some of us admire them. See what I'm saying? And we're playing this cat and mouse game with each other. And it's a game somebody else sets up that we're all playing into. And so I have an issue with police beating down people, knocking people around, harassing people. Both me and my sons were beaten by police. And so we have that. I had police kill 4 of my friends, unarmed, killed. I should hate them. I should go after them. But I get the web that we're all in. I hope I'm making sense. All of us are being put in this place where we can't be fully human. Police themselves. I like to be in the trenches by saying society should not have put that on you to be the army against us. That society did that, and they should not have done that. Because we don't need an army against us, but that's what they did. And so one thing you should know that when there's gang violence and street violence, and police are intricately involved with army. There is no real gang violence without the police into it. And if you know anything about the sheriff's deputies in LA, this is true for other places, because Chicago does the same thing. They are intimately involved in keeping gang warfare going. And I know this for a fact. I've talked to people. I even got people who talk to me, who are cops, who don't talk to other people, but they talk to me. They tell me. So again, we're in the web that somebody else created, but now we're in this web, and then what can we do? It's going back to his thing. What decisions can we make to pull ourselves out of that web that somebody else created so that we can live the liberated, humane life that we were meant to live?
And the only thing I would add one thing to that, just a tiny pieces of data. This specifically to prison officers, their life outcomes are far worse than ours. They live shorter lives, they have worse family lives, they have higher rates of suicide, drug addiction, all the bad markers of like a bad life, they have them worse than people who are in prison, which I think is a terrible thing at the end of the day. I mean, and I think it kind of touches to what Louis is saying. The whole thing is a terrible system. And any human being that gets drug into it gets ground up. So I think that's what I would add to it. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And then my last one would be, what advice would you give to families or children who have loved ones in prison?
I'm sorry?
What advice would you give to families or
who have loved ones in prison?
Ones who are in
right,
prison.
Sure. I mean, I think I can answer that. I mean, the first thing is just because somebody goes to prison, they don't stop being your loved one, right? I mean, and I think people in prison should be treated like fellow human beings, period, under all circumstances. Most people in prison don't get visits. Most people in prison don't have much contact with their families. Most people in prison who have children don't see their children. I fathered a child while I was in prison. She's alive and doing very well, works up in Oakland for a nonprofit that helps represent people going to board. And she would tell you if she was here, children have a right to see their parents, even if they're in prison. And I think the bottom line to that is I would say treat your loved ones who are in prison like your loved ones, right? I mean, I think maybe that's the simplest way of saying it. But I mean, it's a great question, and thanks for asking.
Let me just add, I went to see my granddaughter in prison in July, and like I said, she's in the same institution my son's in. She was out in the street. We couldn't find her. She was prostituting herself. She was on drugs. We were pulling her hair. What we're going to do. Now that she's in prison, believe it or not, we can see her. We can show her that we love her. You know what I'm saying? I think she's better off than being in the street, which is sad, because prison is not a nice place. But at least she's there. And I went to visit her, and you know what? I had not talked to her in 7 years. I had not talked to my granddaughter in 7 years. And she's so happy to see me. You know what I'm saying? And she's trying to act tough. She's trying to act like she was so happy to see me and her brother, my grandson. So I just wanted to let you know that it really means a lot to them when family can stay in touch, when community can stay in touch. It means the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much for speaking with us.